Audio of Unit 10, Contemporary West, the West Between the Wars, also known as the Interwar Years. Okay, so here are some key events along with the impact of today that these key events will have that we're going to be discussing in this unit. Europe faced severe economic problems after World War I, including inflation and the Great Depression. The Great Depression was not just something that happened in the United States. It actually began in the United States and had a ripple effect throughout all of Europe. Dictatorial regimes also began to spread into places like Italy, Germany, and across Eastern Europe. The uncertainties and disillusionment of the times were also reflected in the art and literature of the 1920s and 1930s, which we'll go through also in this lecture. Those feelings of alienation and disillusionment that were left over after the awful, horrific World War I will shine through in a lot of these works of art. So the impact today of these things, well, the current debate over the federal government's role in local affairs and social problems developed in part from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's solution to the Great Depression in the United States that will again have a ripple effect on nations throughout Europe because they had borrowed money from the United States during the 20s to try to recover from the losses they experienced during World War I economically. Also, automobiles, motion pictures, and radios transformed the ways in which people lived during the 1920s and 30s, and they still impact how we live our lives today. The futile search for stability is where we're going to begin. The uneasy peace settlement that ended World War I creates uncertain security. Peace and prosperity were short-lived after World War I. First, we're going to start by talking about John Maynard Keynes. After 1929, a global economic depression weakened Western democracies. But in order to understand why that happened in 1929, we need to go back to 1921 and the aftermath of World War I. Prior to 1921, before the reparation payments required of Germany were raised to $37 billion from $33 billion, that would be interest included on it with $37 billion. The British economist named John Maynard Keynes had said in a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He said, the policy of reducing Germany to servitude for a generation, of degrading the lives of millions of human beings, and of depriving a whole nation of happiness should be abhorrent and detestable. Nations are not authorized by religion or by natural morals to visit on the children of their enemies the misdoings of parents or rulers. In other words, this economic punishment of Germany that happened because of the Versailles Treaty, those reparation payments that they were being forced to pay that were so heavy, will have disastrous consequences in the decades to come. John Maynard Keynes also warned in this same book that doing this, having an economically depressed Germany, would ultimately have bad implications on all of Europe in the future. And boy, would it, as we move towards the rise of Nazi Germany. The peace settlement at the end of World War I that we've discussed in the previous unit, the Versailles Treaty in particular, created repeated border disputes among new nations and left many Germans determined to change the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Though President Wilson and others hoped that the League of Nations could solve many of the new conflicts, the League, as we know, was not able to maintain the peace. One reason for this was that the United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles and could not become a member of the League of Nations as a result. We discussed this in the last unit. Also, the remaining League members could not really agree on when to use force against aggression on other nations. So ultimately, the League of Nations was nothing but a joke from the very beginning. It had no teeth to really enforce anything, and it ultimately failed to avert war 20 years later with World War II. The French demanded that the Treaty of Versailles be strictly enforced in the years following the war, the initial years following World War I. The Germans had said that due to the economic problems, they could no longer continue to pay back that $37 billion that was required of them because most of their money-making territories had also been taken away from them. In other words, how would they ever pay those reparation payments if their ability to make money was also taken away from them? The French army, in response to calls by Germany to revise the treaty to make the reparation payment requirements a little less or spread out over a longer period of time, responded instead of revision by occupying territory that had belonged to Germany that had not been taken away from Germany initially in the peace treaty, the Ruhr Valley. It was an industrial mining center, one of the few that was left in the hands of the Germans after the Versailles Treaty was signed. And now, as you can see in this map, France takes over that region as punishment for Germany not making the reparation payments on time. The French planned to take the reparations by operating German industries there in that region themselves. So that's how we'll get our payment. If the government's not going to pay us, we're going to seize these territories, these money-making territories, and take the money ourselves from these industries. This is also known as the Ruhr Crisis, 1923. In response, German workers went on strike. The government paid them, however, to try to stop the strike by printing more money. This, of course, is not a way to solve an economic problem. If you just print more money, you devalue the currency. So the German currency was devalued and inflation increased once again that had begun before the end of the war. The German mark, that's like their dollar, if you will, but the German mark became completely worthless. It wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on. As you can see here, a man is wallpapering his wall with German marks because they're worthless. By the end of 1923, it took more than 4 trillion German marks to equal $1 US. Now that is massive inflation. The economic problems ultimately led to political unrest in Germany as well. Other countries tried to step in to help, including the United States. The Dawes Plan was one of these attempts to help Germany by also helping the other allied nations that had participated in the war with the United States. The Dawes Plan of the United States began by reducing the reparation payments that Germany was required to pay with what the nation could afford. In other words, they would probably have to pay back the full amount eventually, but they would be given more time to pay back those amounts. The plan also loaned Germany, the United States loaned Germany about $200 million so Germany could pay back some of those reparation payments. As you see here, ultimately the U.S. over about 5 years will loan $2.5 billion to Germany. Germany will be able to pay back the Allies, meaning France and Great Britain, about $2 billion in reparation payments over that period of time. Now they still owe, 35 million more, but it's a start, 35 billion more, excuse me. And then the Allies could then pay the $2.6 billion that they owe the U.S. back in war debt payments as well. That Germany would be able to take that $500 million that was left over from what they had to pay to the Allies from what they got on loan from the U.S., if you look at the triangle beside here, to reinvest in their own economy and to try to jumpstart that economy so they could once again start making their own money, and then they could pay back the loans that the U.S. is paying them, so they can pay back their reparation payments on their own without having to borrow more money to pay it. This started an economic recovery in Germany as well as in France and England that were getting some of this money through reparation payments between 1924 and 1929. As Germany began to recover, the French and the Germans actually became a little bit more cooperative with each other. Eventually, the Ruhr crisis was settled in 1925 when both Germany and France signed what was called the Treaty of Locarno, okay, or sometimes called the Locarno Treaty, which basically guaranteed Germany's western borders, basically said that the French would no longer try to invade some of those border territories in exchange for reparation payments. It was seen by many as the beginning of a lasting peace. Maybe finally we'd have a lasting peace. In 1926, Germany was also allowed to join the League of Nations, which they were not allowed to join right after the war ended. So things seem to be stepping in the right direction. In 1928, in an attempt to outlaw war altogether, 62 nations signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, sometimes called the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact of 1928, in which they pledged to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. As you see here on the right, it outlawed war as a tool of foreign policy. Said the only acceptable use of war was for defensive purposes, and as I said, 62 nations signed it. While Germany had been forced to reduce its military with the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I, no other European nation was willing to take this step. So this was an attempt to try to force them to do so. The trust of the European countries for each other did not go that far, though, and so the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact ultimately failed. You can't really outlaw war, folks, because it goes against the sovereignty of nations to defend themselves. Everything seemed to be going better, at least economically, with the Dawes Plan trying to, U.S. dollars being invested into European nations to help them recover their economy so they could then make more money and then pay back those loans with interest. That was the whole point of us loaning them that money. Until 1929, when the Great Depression hits. The brief period of European prosperity ended with the Great Depression in 1929. Okay, the Great Depression had two main causes. One was the downturn in the economies of nations during the second half of the 1920s. The second cause was the collapse of the U.S. stock market in 1929. Both of these things will have an impact on this, what will be a worldwide Great Depression, not just in the United States. Since 1924, Germany had been borrowing money from the U.S. banks through the Dawes Plan to make those reparation payments. After the U.S. stock market crashed in October of 1929 with the Great Crash, American investors pulled their money out of Germany and insisted that those loans be paid back. This will weaken the banks in Germany and other European countries that they were making reparation payments to. Ultimately, this pulls the rug out from under all of those European economies that had just started to make some headway in recovering from the losses they experienced economically in World War I. Also, if you look over here underneath the stacks of German marks that are worthless that children are playing with, like blocks, as trade and industrial production slowed, huge numbers of people lost their jobs. Though there had been depressions in Europe before, the Great Depression was far worse. Unemployed and homeless people filled the streets of many countries. Governments did not know how to deal with the Depression. They tried to lower wages and raise tariffs on foreign goods, but that only made things worse. Some governments, such as the United States, became more involved in the economy through government policies like the New Deal. Communism, however, became more popular in many places, in others, fascism. So we're going to see the connection between the economic depression and the rise of totalitarian dictatorships in Europe. It's important to remember that economically depressed nations are more vulnerable to totalitarian takeovers. We are going to discuss two different kinds of totalitarianism. Left-wing totalitarianism, meaning on the left end of the political spectrum, is communism. Right-wing totalitarianism is fascism. What we're going to see is that both are on opposite ends of the political spectrum through their political beliefs and ideologies. But they use very similar methods to get and maintain power. So oftentimes it's confusing because they look very similar because the methods that they use are so similar. So it's sometimes easy to get them mixed up. Just so you know, we will talk about left-wing totalitarianism as communism, talking specifically about the Soviet Union, starting with Lenin and then moving on to Stalin. We'll talk about right-wing totalitarianism with fascism, starting in Italy with Mussolini, and then eventually being perfected by fascism in Germany with the Nazi Party under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. The Great Depression led many people to follow political leaders who proposed simple solutions in return for complete or total power. Democracy was threatened everywhere as a result. So instead of democracy being a fruit of the war, of World War I, like Wilson had hoped when he wrote his 14 points that we discussed in the last unit, instead the real political fruit of the war will be the rise of totalitarian regimes, both left-wing and right-wing. Now let's talk about democratic states after the war, okay? So before we get to a discussion of totalitarianism, let's discuss what happened immediately after World War I with the creation of many new European states that were carved out of the old empires that fell in World War I. In 1919, many European states had democratic governments, most of them giving women the right to vote as well, but not in places like Italy, Switzerland, and even in France. Okay, so let's talk about the democratic states first. In Germany, prior to the rise of the Nazis, as we know, at the end of World War I, Germany established a new government. They ousted Kaiser Wilhelm or William II, and they created a republic government. The Weimar Republic was created in 1918, but it had many problems. It was the one that signed the armistice that ended the war, and it was the one that was forced to sign the peace treaty, the Versailles Treaty, that was so hated by most all German people as being seen as them being stabbed in the back, thinking they were going to get Wilson's 14 points as the basis of the treaty, but getting something far more punishing towards Germany. Now, Paul von Hindenburg was elected the first president of the Weimar Republic, but he was not a very strong leader. The Weimar Republic also faced serious economic problems in 1919. Runaway inflation that I mentioned before caused people to lose their incomes and their savings. We know they also had trouble making money because they had so many territories taken away from them with the Versailles Treaty, and they had heavy reparation requirements that they were supposed to pay up. All of these things made it very difficult for the Weimar Republic to survive. In 1929, Germany suffered under the Great Depression even more than most other nations because they were already so economically depressed. The recovery that they had for 5 years was not enough to pull them completely, into a booming economy. So millions of people ultimately in Germany had no jobs. They had almost 48% unemployment in Germany in 1929. After World War I, let's talk about what happened in France. France became the strongest power on the European continent. okay, on the continent, meaning that, yeah, Great Britain might have been equally as strong, but they were not on the continent, okay? France was able to avoid serious effects of the Great Depression, but only until about 1932 when they started suffering greatly under the economic decline. However, when the economic instability occurred, there became political chaos. A series of cabinets came and went in France. In 1936, a French Communist Party, French Socialists, and French Radicals all combined together. They united together to form a new big party called the Popular Front, the Popular Front government. The government was not able to solve the larger problems of the Depression, though. The Popular Front began programs for workers, including the right to negotiate with employees, collective bargaining, a minimum wage, a 2-week paid vacation, and a 40-hour work week in industry. But unfortunately, it would not be able to resolve all of the issues that were facing France economically and politically. And by 1939, that Popular Front will fall. Great Britain, what happened in Great Britain? They suffered severe unemployment in the early 1920s, but rebounded somewhat between 1925 and 1929 thanks to the Dawes Plan and thanks to those reparation payments being paid from Germany due to the Dawes Plan, and they were able to start paying off some of their debts that they owed to the U.S. as well. As Britain's economic problems continued, however, during the Great Depression, once 1929 hit, governments changed in England from the Labour Party being dominant in the Parliament, that's the more liberal party, to the Conservatives having more sway in the Parliament, the more right-wingers. A British economist, again, John Maynard Keynes, argued in 1936 that unemployment in England came not from overproduction of goods, but instead from a decline in demand. He said that government should finance projects that will get people to work and will encourage them to start spending money again. Even if this meant that the government is hiring these people to do these government programs like building bridges, building roads, etc., even if it meant that the government had to go into deficit spending or even going into debt to do it. Keynes said that if people went back to work, demand for products would eventually increase. People are more willing to buy products when they have a little bit more money in their pocket. And Keynes proposed also that the government should finance these projects such as highway building to create jobs for the unemployed and kickstart the economy again. Most British politicians of the time, however, ignored his ideas. But in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt initiated Keynesian-style economics with the New Deal to try to deal with the Depression, the Great Depression here in the United States. As I said, the United States was terribly affected by the Great Depression, especially when the stock market crashed, kickstarting the whole thing in October of 1929. Industrial production fell by almost 50% between 1929 and 1932. By 1933, more than 12 million people were out of work in the U.S. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, and he instituted a policy called the New Deal based on Keynesian economics, what John Maynard Keynes had said the government should do. The government of the United States ultimately created jobs by funding programs of public works. Again, just like John Maynard Keynes had said should be done. Roosevelt also pushed through the Social Security Act, which created a system of old age pensions and unemployment insurance for workers that was backed by the federal government. While the New Deal may have prevented a social revolution in the United States, it did not solve the problem of unemployment. That will not really be resolved until World War II begins. World War II and the mobilization for World War II ultimately is what pulls the United States out of the Great Depression. All right, so I already kind of alluded to the rise of dictatorial regimes totalitarianism of the left wing and the right wing that I mentioned before, but there are also other kinds of dictatorial governments called authoritarianism. The authoritarian governments that we'll talk about are more like the old style absolute monarchies. They do not have as much total control over the minds of the people like the totalitarian dictators do. The totalitarian dictators use indoctrination of the public to sway public opinion in their direction, so they have complete and utter support from the people. Between 1919 and 1939, all the major countries of Europe, except for France and Great Britain, had adopted some form of dictatorial government. Great Britain and France will remain republics or democracies. Of course, Great Britain will remain a constitutional monarchy, and France will remain the Third French Republic. But we see that most of the rest of the continent of Europe will adopt some form of dictatorial government. We see left-wing totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. We see right-wing fascism totalitarianism in Italy, as well as right-wing fascism totalitarianism with the Nazis in Germany. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of dictators and what totalitarianism is. A new form of dictatorship was the modern totalitarian state that rises in the 1920s and 30s, really the 1930s mostly, in Europe. Totalitarian governments aim to control all aspects of their citizens' lives. Totalitarian governments wanted to control the hearts and minds of everyone, and they used mass propaganda and modern communication like mass media to achieve their goals. A single leader was in charge of a single party that led these totalitarian states. We will compare left-wing and right-wing totalitarianism as we go through this as well. And I'll discuss this more specifically in class with some illustrations on the board that you'll understand. In general, with totalitarianism, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, there were no individual freedoms or limits to the power of the government that is in the control of the one party that is under the leadership of one man. A one-man, one-party dictatorship determines all. Individuals were considered subservient to the collective will of the masses, which was controlled by the state. So this is not just happening in communist governments. This is also happening in more right-wing conservative governments as well. That's why we say there's two kinds of totalitarianism: left-wing communism and right-wing fascism. The state, in both kinds of totalitarianism, demanded that its citizens actively support any and all of the goals of the state in the control of the party in control of the dictator, or the party in the hands of the dictator. Let's start by talking about the rise of fascism in Italy. This will be the first brand of right-wing totalitarianism. It all begins with Benito Mussolini in Italy. He will establish the first European fascist government in the early 1920s in Italy. Fascism is a name that he gave to it, using some imagery from the old Roman Empire. Fascism glorifies the state above the individual. It advocates a strong central government and a single dictator to run the state. But it is not communism. It is instead right-wing totalitarianism, where they believe in nationalism and they pit different ethnic groups against one another. Right-wing totalitarianism under fascism believes in having unity in the nation through pure ethnic bloodlines. Whereas communism, left-wing communism, like we discussed with the rise of the Soviet Union under Lenin initially, pits one class against another. Now, why did this happen, this right-wing totalitarianism begin in Italy when it did? is because Italy suffered severe economic problems after World War I. There was a great deal of social upheaval as a result. And remember, Italy was angry and bitter towards those allies that they had had at the end of World War I, Great Britain and France and the United States, because they felt like they were not given the lands that they were promised for their participation on the Allied side of World War I. Many Italians were also afraid that there might be a communist takeover, as there was in Russia. And so the right-wing group of totalitarian supporters ultimately gained wide support because they said this was better than a communist takeover. Even though it doesn't seem a whole lot different, it's still totalitarian. Mussolini formed groups of armed fascists called black shirts who attacked socialists, strikers, and anyone who opposed the fascists. Mussolini also, like I said, appealed to nationalist pride among Italians. This was a key to right-wing totalitarianism, extreme nationalism based on ethnic purity. He demanded that Italy get more land from the peace treaties of World War I. In 1922, Mussolini had enough followers that he forced the Italian king, the constitutional monarch, to make him the prime minister. This was the infamous March on Rome, where Mussolini and his black shirts, which was basically a group of old former soldiers from World War I who were, disenchanted with the current state of the government in Italy. They marched into the capital city of Rome, and they basically browbeat the Italian king into making Mussolini prime minister. They did not win through the ballot box. They did not take over the Italian parliament by winning the majority of seats in the parliament. Instead, they had a coup. As prime minister, Mussolini created a fascist dictatorship and dismantled the constitutional monarchy that existed in Italy. The monarch was removed, all other political parties were outlawed, and Mussolini became a right-wing fascist dictator. He added extensive powers to the government and was given the power to pass laws by decree without having to go through any kind of approval process through a parliament or legislature. Also, the police were given the authority to arrest anyone on Mussolini's or his supporters' command. They set up ultimately a secret police force, and at the end of 1926, Mussolini was the only ruler of Italy. Mussolini was a one-man dictator that was in charge of the one-party system, and he was called Il Duce, which just means the leader. In 1926, the fascists had outlawed also all opposition, which means all other political parties were outlawed, and only the fascist party remained. So really, there's no point in having a parliament if there's only one group that are allowed, one party that are allowed to run for office. This means that ultimately Mussolini has dictatorial power. Mussolini used the secret police that he had established to control the people. Indoctrination is a big part of totalitarian governments, whether they are the left-wing variety or the right-wing variety. So this right-wing variety, the fascists in Italy, controlled all mass media outlets. They used the media to spread pro-fascist propaganda. The fascists also created youth groups that focused on military activities to indoctrinate the young. While the Italian fascists tried to create a new nation of fit, disciplined, and war-loving people, they still maintained traditional values about the important place of women and families in society. Mussolini never achieved complete totalitarian control over Italy like Hitler and Stalin did in Germany and Soviet Union. Of course, Hitler being a right-wing fascist like Mussolini, but Stalin being a left-wing communist totalitarian. Why is this? Well, for example, Mussolini still recognized the sovereign independence of the Vatican in Rome, and Catholicism as the state religion. He made an agreement with the Pope, Pope Pius XII at the time, and the Lateran Treaty, which basically made the Vatican itself its own independent city, in exchange for the Pope agreeing not to get involved in Italian politics, not to try to stop Mussolini. During World War II, Pope Pius XI, not the 12th, the 11th, will look the other way when Mussolini creates concentration camps for the Jews, because he had done so at the behest of Hitler, whom he had allied with during World War II. In all areas of Italian life, there was a large gap between fascist policies, however, and actual practice. They had sterner policies on paper than they were actually able to put into practice. It will not be that way in Germany, however. They will be able to put those staunch practices into place. Now let's talk more about the rise of dictatorial regimes, a new era in the Soviet Union. Let's talk specifically about left-wing totalitarianism in the communist state of the Soviet Union. It starts with Lenin and his economic problems and leads to the rise of Stalin. In the early 20s, millions died in Russia during a great famine caused by a drought. This was quickly on the heels of the tragic Russian Civil War that had taken the lives of so many millions as well. Industrial output was reduced to 20% of what it had been in 1913 under Lenin's economic policy known as war communism that we talked about in the previous unit. The country and government were on the verge of collapse, just as Lenin had taken control and been able to keep control after his victory in the Russian Civil War. So in 1921, Lenin, being the totalitarian dictator that he was, decided that he had the right to change his policy, even if it went against his traditional communist beliefs. Lenin created a new economic policy, the NEP, to replace war communism. He abandoned war communism instead in favor of a system of modified capitalism blended with communism. I know that sounds like mixing oil and water, but let me explain to you what we mean. He allowed the peasant farmers to sell some of their produce on the market for a profit. And some small businesses also were able to be privately owned. Still, the big farms and the big businesses were owned by the state, but this small allowance of a little tiny bit of capitalism made people more productive. The farmers still had to produce food and hand it over to the state, but anything above and beyond the quota that they were told to observe, they were able to sell in the marketplace and make a profit from it. This incentivized farmers to grow more, to work harder, and to grow more. And ultimately, the economy started to recover a little bit. The problem was, for the staunch communists, it wasn't true communism. It was a blending of communism and capitalism, which, of course, communists hate capitalism. The government still controlled heavy industries and banking, but the NEP did save the Soviet Union from economic ruin. But many of the, like I said, the staunch communists saw it only as a temporary measure, that they would be able, once the economy recovered enough, to abandon that little bit of capitalism more in favor of true communism once again. All right, so like I had said before, 1922 marked the beginning of what is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, or Soviet Union. Now, in 1924, Lenin dies. Now, the problem in a totalitarian dictatorship is there's no guaranteed succession over who's going to take over next. It's not a dynasty. They aren't kings. They aren't emperors. They're totalitarian dictators. So it because the totalitarian nature of power is based on ultimately the power of the will of the dictator, when that dictator dies, it sometimes leaves chaos in its wake. Now, Lenin had died because he suffered a series of strokes after an assassination attempt during the Russian Civil War left a bullet lodged in his brain. It was inoperable, could not be removed without killing him, so it was left in there. But after a couple of years, he started having strokes because of this bullet that was in his brain. And eventually, the strokes killed him. A bitter power struggle for power in the Politburo ensued between Trotsky, aka Snowball in Animal Farm, and Joseph Stalin, aka Napoleon in Animal Farm. They were personal rivals in the Politburo. The Politburo was a committee that controlled the policies of the official Communist Party. One faction of it was led by Leon Trotsky. Even though he wanted to end the NEP and industrialize the nation at the expense of the peasants, his ideas was mostly because he wanted to spread communism to other nations, and spent a lot of time outside of Russia trying to promote the idea of communism to other nations. Meanwhile, another faction rejected worldwide communism at this time and instead wanted to try to fix the problem at home first, or perfect communism at home first, and then eventually spread it outward. Now, Joseph Stalin would be the leader of this faction. Trotsky would be the leader of the other. Joseph Stalin will eventually, even though it says here wanted to continue the NEP while building a socialist state, eventually Joseph Stalin recognizes that any form of capitalism is not okay with a communist regime. So he will reverse that NEP and instead initiate new economic plans himself, his 5-year plans. Ultimately, Stalin will be able to outmaneuver Trotsky for control of the Politburo. He will run Trotsky out of the Soviet Union. His personal assassins will chase Trotsky across the globe for several years. It will not be until 1940 that his assassins catch up with Trotsky, who was living in hiding in Mexico City. In 1940, he will be assassinated. He will be hacked to death with an axe. And ultimately, Stalin will be able to maintain control, really starting in 1924, 25, but really being able to solidify his position by the time we get to 1928 in Russia. Stalin will hold the job of what he calls general secretary. General secretary is the dictator of the communist government. And as such, he appointed thousands of officials throughout Russia. Stalin used his position to gain complete control over the Communist Party and set up once again a one-man, one-party dictatorship. By 1929, he had removed all of the old Bolsheviks, even though he had originally been one, from power, because he was worried that they might challenge his authority. Those that had favored Trotsky, for example, to take over after Lenin's death, they could not remain in the Soviet Union as far as Stalin was concerned, because they could be a potential threat to his power at any given time. So instead, he liquidates all of them. He has them all rounded up and either imprisoned in concentration camps, really work camps, the Gulag work camps in Siberia, where they will be worked to death, or summarily executed right off the bat. Stalin becomes a very powerful dictator as a result. Trotsky, as I said before, was expelled, ended up in Mexico, where he was killed finally in 1940, probably on Stalin's orders. Not probably, definitely. The Stalinist era began a time of radical changes in the Soviet Union. Stalin ended the NEP and instituted the first 5-year plan. He will have a series of 5-year plans, ultimately, that set economic goals for 5-year periods in Russia, or in the Soviet Union as it is now called. The first 5-year plan emphasized to finally fully industrialize Russia, focusing on heavy industry like electricity, petroleum, oil, steel production, rather than consumer goods, and also the production of some capital goods. The plan greatly increased the output of heavy machinery and the production of oil and steel. The 5-year plans, however, took a heavy toll on the Russian people because Stalin put heavy quotas on the Russian workers to produce. Remember, the state controls the industries, the state puts heavy quotas on those industries, and the people have to produce or they are eliminated, okay, killed, sent to the Gulag work camps, worked to death, etc. So, yes, Russia will finally fully industrialize due to Stalin's first 5-year plan, but at a very heavy expense. Millions of Soviet citizens die in the process from overwork or being eliminated because they were seen as potential threats. Urban housing, however, for millions of workers will be built as part of that, but the housing was terrible. Shoddy construction ultimately caused many deaths as well. Wages ultimately ended up declining rather than rising. But the communist state claimed a victory because they did finally industrialize Russia or Soviet Union. The government dealt with these problems by using propaganda to boost morale and to hide what was really going on, to hide the bad press, not allow it to be public. Stalin also, in his second 5-year plan, focused on collectivizing agriculture in Russia. Collectivization was a system in which the government took over ownership of private farms and had the peasants work instead on large collective farms that were controlled by the state. Again, those farmers that had benefited under the NEP, they were the kulak farmers, ultimately are the ones that do not like the collectivization of agriculture. Many peasants resisted collectivization by hoarding food, not handing it over to the state to be redistributed, by killing livestock so they would not be able to be taken by the state to be redistributed. Okay, Stalin responded to these actions by increasing the number of farms in the program, by collectivizing more of the farms, taking the private farms away from private farmers, and forcing them to go work on the large collective farms. During the early 1930s, millions of Russians starved to death due to food shortages from collectivization. Collectivization did not produce enough food to keep up with the demand for food in Russia, and ultimately millions of peasants starved to death in the process. Those who resisted Stalin's programs were sent to forced labor camps, those Gulag work camps in Siberia, where they were forced to work on public projects, usually worked to death. Stalin overturned social legislation passed in the early 1920s by Lenin and the old Bolsheviks. These included laws protecting the rights of women, such as divorce and being able to work outside the home. He overturned them because he wanted to have more control over women and force them to stay home and have babies to make more workers for the factories. Stalin also conducted purges of old Bolsheviks and others, many of whom were executed. He saw anybody who might be seen as a potential threat to his power as dangerous, and so he'd get rid of them. Others were sent to Siberia. The purges of Stalin really spared no part of society. So one of the points I want to make about totalitarian regimes, whether they are left-wing, like we see here with communism, or right-wing, like we see with fascism and Nazism, nobody is safe. Even if you were a member of the official party, you still were not completely safe. Because if the dictator changes his mind at any point on what he believes is right and what he believes is wrong, and you end up on the wrong side of things, you're in trouble. So living in a totalitarian regime is like standing at the edge of the ocean, letting the waves wash over your feet, and the sand underneath your feet starts to shift, it starts to move, and if you don't move your footing, you fall down. That is basically the way it is. It's always shifting sand. It's always unstable ground that you're standing on. No one's safe. In most of the countries of Eastern Europe, authoritarian governments replaced parliamentary governments between the 20s and 30s. Okay, those states that had been carved out of the old empires that fell after World War I ultimately abandoned democracy in favor of authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes in these states were similar to totalitarian states concerned with social order, but they did not try to create a new mass society that had complete control over the people through indoctrination. Parliamentary systems in Eastern Europe failed in part because there was no tradition of democracy that they could base that on. Most of the peasants were illiterate, and so democracy will not flourish in Eastern Europe, in those new states. The only place where we see democracy survive is in Czechoslovakia. Landowners and the churches ultimately in these areas feared that democracy could lead to revolution, even communist revolutions, and they supported authoritarian governments in order to keep order, in order for the landowners to be able to protect their property rights. As I said before, Czechoslovakia will be the only country to keep a democratic government in those new territories that have been carved out of the old Ottoman, Austrian, and German empires. Those Balkans regions that we talked about in the last unit. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all of those territories. Out of all of them, Czechoslovakia will be the only one that will keep their democratic government. The rest will fall prey to authoritarian governments. We even see some authoritarian states in Western Europe, for example, in Spain. In 1936, General Francisco Franco used the military forces to revolt against the democratic government that existed in Spain, and a civil war broke out as a result of that. Germany and Italy ultimately supported Franco's side because they saw him as a fellow right-wing totalitarian or a fellow fascist. The Soviet Union, however, since they were on the opposite end of the political spectrum, even though they're still totalitarian, left-wing totalitarian, and volunteers from other countries actually supported the Republican government, not so much just because they supported republicanism, but because they were against fascism. So even though communists are totalitarian, they are left-wing totalitarians, and they do not see eye to eye with the right-wing totalitarians that are fascists. Franco and the Spanish fascists, however, won the Spanish Civil War after he captured Madrid, capital city, in 1939. He then began an authoritarian dictatorship based on fascist principles that lasted for many decades. Ultimately, he would not have been able to achieve this if he had not received the support from both Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy as a fellow fascist. Now let's talk a little bit about Hitler and Nazi Germany, the right-wing brand of totalitarianism. Yes, I know we already talked about fascism a bit with Mussolini in Italy. We're going to see how right-wing totalitarianism under fascism and Nazism, as it will be called in Germany, was perfected by Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler and the Nazi Party established a totalitarian state in Germany, right-wing version. Many Germans accepted the Nazi dictatorship, while other Germans suffered greatly under Hitler's rule. Ultimately, you do need to recognize, however, that Hitler and the Nazis were elected into power. They did not launch a coup against the government that was successful. And so they recognized that they had to win through the ballot box. So it's different than what Mussolini did in Italy in that way. Not that they didn't attempt to have a coup on the government, but they will not be successful at it. We'll discuss all this in the remaining slide. All right, so let's talk about Hitler, who he was, and what his views were to begin with. Here's a picture of a young Adolf Hitler wearing his German army uniform from World War I, prior to him cutting his mustache in the typical, Hitler-esque mustache that he did to get a seal on his gas mask in World War I. Adolf Hitler was actually born in Austria, not in Germany. Okay, he was an Austrian, but of course, an Austrian is of Germanic descent. Okay, but he failed secondary school. He was rejected by the Vienna Art Academy, the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. And it was in Vienna that he developed his ideas based on racism, particularly against Jewish people, at the core of his beliefs. There was a anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna that gave really big speeches on a regular basis in Vienna while Hitler was living there. And Hitler observed him and recognized that if he could learn to master the crowds with this hatred, this hate speech, like that mayor of Vienna did, he could really make something of himself in the future. He was an extreme nationalist, and he understood the use of propaganda and terror. Hitler eventually will leave Austria and move to Germany, where he becomes a naturalized citizen prior to World War I beginning. He eventually serves on the Western Front of the war for 4 years as a German soldier in World War I. After he survived the war, even though he had been gassed in the trenches at one point, he survived the war. He became increasingly bitter about the situation that Germany found itself in due to that hated Versailles Treaty. So he started to create his own political party, the National Socialists, or the Nazi Party. In 1919 is when he joins this extreme right-wing nationalist party, the National Socialists, nicknamed the Nazis. He joined this in Munich, in the city of Munich. By 1921, Hitler controlled that party and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party for short. Now, this splinter party in the Weimar Republic of Germany only had about 7 members to begin with. But within a few years, Hitler will increase the popularity of this party, and they will start to run for office in the German parliament, the German Reichstag. Within 2 years, the Nazi Party had grown to 55,000 people, with 15,000 in the militia forces, most of them being former soldiers in the German army, like Hitler. So they felt emboldened. The Nazis were large enough by 1923 that they felt emboldened, and Hitler and the Nazis decided to stage an uprising in Munich. This uprising took place in Munich, the city of Munich, and ultimately was called the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Now, the word putsch just means rebellion, okay? It was an attempt to take over the city government of Munich, use it as a stepping stone to taking over all of Bavaria, and then, of course, as a stepping stone to take over all of Germany, forcing the Weimar Republic to come down. This was a fascist attempt to take over the government in a coup. It did not work. It was quickly crushed, and Hitler was sent to prison along with the other ringleaders. It was while Hitler was in prison that he wrote his famous autobiography, his memoirs, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, in which he not only talked about his own life in the past, but also outlined his basic ideas and plans for the future, not just of himself, but also of the Nazi Party. His ideas combined German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. So it's a fascist brand. Nazism, however, will take things to the next level. Okay? Anti-Semitism and German nationalism combine, and this notion that the only people that are worthy of living in German society are those of the natural German race or Aryan race. When I say German, I mean of Germanic descent. So that would include the Austrians as well. He also embraced the notion that stronger nations should expand and obtain living space. Lebensraum is the word. And that superior leaders should rule over the masses. Ultimately, he argued that the Aryan race, the Germanic peoples, should be able to take more territory and grow and ultimately grow to control even more of Europe, maybe all of it. So taking those territories away from the more, quote, inferior races. This is why right-wing totalitarianism is based more on ethnic purity, whereas left-wing totalitarianism, communism, like we saw in the Soviet Union, is based more on class struggle. He realized that the way to power after the failed Munich beer hall putsch was not through revolution, but through instead legal means. So that will be his next approach. His book, Mein Kampf, will be published in 1925 after he gets out of prison. He wrote it while in prison. And when he gets out of prison and publishes it in 1925, it's a huge hit in Germany. It becomes a bestseller in Germany because one of the big things that he spoke out against was the Weimar Republic signing of the Versailles Treaty, which was seen as a stab in the back. And he argued that the only way Germany would ever be able to redeem itself again in the eyes on the world stage would be to go against the Versailles Treaty, which was unfair and a dictated peace to them anyways, pull themselves up and take the territories that they thought belonged to them, and get rid of all of the inferior races that lived in Europe. Instead, it could be completely controlled by the Aryan race. These ideas in Nazism will be very popular among the German population that are so bitter about what they had suffered in the war and the economic decline that they had suffered as a result of those harsh Versailles Treaty terms. When Hitler got out of prison, like I said, he worked to expand the Nazi Party. He got a lot of members of the party because his book, Mein Kampf, became a bestseller. And by 1929, the Nazis had a national party organization. And by 1931, it was the largest political party in the Reichstag, or the parliament. They had won the largest percentage of seats in the German Reichstag, in the German parliament. The problem was it wasn't a majority because they had a multi-party system in Germany, and therefore it still had to be a coalition government. Germany's economic problems helped the rise of the Nazi Party, though. Many people were in desperate situations, which made an extreme political party under an extreme dictator more attractive. Hitler and the Nazis were presenting themselves as the saviors of the German people, and what they said made sense to a lot of people. Hitler appealed to national pride and militarism to gain the support of the German people. And those elections of 1931 and by 1932 in particular, okay, after 1930, those elections gave rise to the party. After 1930, the Reichstag itself had little power. The 1932 elections had Nazis winning the plurality in that Reichstag parliament. Like I said before, the largest percentage in the Reichstag. And ultimately, Hitler, as the head of that party, would be named Chancellor or Prime Minister of the Reichstag. Now, as Hitler's power grew more and more, right-wing industrial leaders, aristocrats, military officers, and high-level bureaucrats wanted him to lead the country. In 1933, the Nazis pressured President Hindenburg to allow Hitler to become chancellor and ultimately create a new government. That Weimar Republic that had an executive branch with a president as well as the legislative branch in the Reichstag ultimately was too weak to stop the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. Once Hitler and the Nazis got control of the Reichstag, the legislature, they will shortly be able to dismantle democracy completely in Germany. And this was with the will of the people behind them. The will of the people, because the people saw that democracy under the Weimar Republic as weak and ineffectual, and that the only way Germany would ever be able to be a dominant nation again would be in the hands of the Nazis and Hitler. Within 2 months of Hitler becoming the chancellor of the Reichstag, Hitler had set up a new government. Okay, the Nazis were now in complete control. In March of 1933, the Reichstag building, the building that the Reichstag, the parliament, met in, actually was set ablaze. There was a fire that broke out mysteriously in that building. And ultimately, Hitler and the Nazis were able to use that fire to their advantage. They blamed the fire. They said it was set by a group in Germany, another political party, the German Communist Party. They used this as an excuse to dismantle that Communist Party and outlaw it. And the rest of the German Reichstag that were members of other parties other than the Nazis and the Communists ultimately went along with the Nazis and said, yes, do this. The Red Scare had begun in German politics. Ultimately, this Red Scare allowed for Hitler and the Nazis to gain even more power. By March of 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which gave the government the power to ignore the Constitution for 4 years and pass laws to deal with the nation's problems in this state of emergency. Not only did they eliminate the Communist Party and outlaw it, under the Enabling Act, Hitler became a full dictator. He outlawed all political parties except for the Nazi Party and ultimately became a right-wing totalitarian dictator. As you see in the picture here, the Enabling Act, a law giving Hitler dictatorial powers, was passed. This law, to remedy the distress of the people of the Reich, allowed Hitler's government to pass laws without the approval of a Reichstag or a president, so there was no longer a need for a Reichstag or a president. Hitler was der Führer, the dictator. The act, as I said, gave Hitler a legal basis for his actions. It was only supposed to be dictatorial power for 4 years, but of course he'll never give it back. He had become a dictator, appointed by the Reichstag, and then he will dismantle the democracy. The Weimar Republic disappears, and we have the beginning of Nazi Germany under the leadership of the dictator Hitler. Once in power, the Nazis established control over all aspects of government. Jews were purged from the civil service, and trade unions were dissolved. Concentration camps were set up for Nazi opponents. Initially, these concentration camps were for political prisoners. Eventually, especially as World War II begins and continues, they will be used for many other purposes, including as slave camps for making the Jews their slaves, as well as eventually extermination camps, where they will exterminate the Jews and try to commit genocide in Hitler's final solution. We'll get to all of that when we get to World War II. Jews, however, were purged initially after 1933 from civil service. They were not allowed to participate in civil service in the government. Their right to vote was taken away. They were not allowed to participate in trade unions. Trade unions also were eventually dissolved completely. As I said, concentration camps set up. All political parties except for the Nazis were abolished, and the Nazis had set up the basis for a complete totalitarian state. When Hindenburg, who had been the president of the Weimar Republic, died, the Nazis abolished the presidency, and Hitler became Germany's only leader. He was known to the German people as der Führer, which just means leader. And the Third Reich had begun. Here's a British cartoon by David Lowe of 1934. It said, "They salute with both hands now," meaning that he had taken complete control. Hitler had a goal in creating a totalitarian state. He wanted to develop an Aryan racial state to dominate Europe and possibly the world. The Nazis wanted the Germans to create a new empire as the Romans had done. Hitler thought there had been 2 previous German empires or Reichs. The Holy Roman Empire was the first, and then the German Empire 1871 to 1918 was the second, and now he had initiated the third. Hitler called his empire the Third Reich and demanded active involvement from the German people. The Nazis used economic policies, mass rallies, demonstrations, organizations, and terror to control the country and further their goals. While Hitler ruled absolutely or totally over the Nazi Party, there were some internal struggles within the party that would have to be dealt with. Just like we saw with left-wing totalitarianism in the USSR under Stalin, oftentimes even within the party, there will be purges that will happen. Just because you're a member of the official party does not mean that you are safe, because if the dictator decides that you could be a potential threat or enemy, you can be eliminated. To control the nation, the Nazis used the SS, or guard squadrons. This will become the secret police force for the Nazis. Just like the Cheka had been initiated as a secret police force in Soviet Union, starting with Lenin, continuing with Stalin, it'll eventually become known as the KGB. The SS will be the secret police force in Nazi Germany. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the SS will control all the police forces throughout Germany. Terror and ideology drove the SS. Terror included repression, murder, and even death camps being created to deal with the enemies of the state. Himmler's goal was to further the Aryan, and eventually we will see that the SS will use their powers to round up anybody that is seen as not just a potential political threat to the Nazis, but also a potential social threat or ethnic threat, ethnic cleansing going on throughout German-controlled territory in Europe with those concentration camps. The other thing we see, however, is the Nazi state between 1933 and 1939 at the dawn of World War II, Hitler actually does improve the economy of Germany. Puts people back to work with public works projects and grants to private construction companies. If anybody's ever seen Schindler's List, Oskar Schindler as a businessman is one of those businessmen that benefits by a partnership with the Nazi Party, by getting a Nazi contract to fulfill requirements of the government to build things for the government. Hitler also embarked on massive rearmament program to stimulate the economy. He had to officially, publicly reject the Versailles Treaty to do this, and the world leaders did nothing to stop him. The reason why is by the 1930s, when Hitler had come to power, most of those other nations in Europe were also economically depressed due to the Great Depression. So instead of trying to stop him, they really were more focused inwardly on what was going on in their own countries. They did not want to go back to war to try to stop German aggression under Hitler's authority. And so they thought they could appease him instead. Let him take a little bit here and there, and maybe he'll be satisfied. If they had read Mein Kampf, which they didn't, it was a bestseller inside Germany, but not so much outside of Germany. But if they had read it, they would have known that he would have never been stopped, that you cannot appease a man like Hitler. We'll talk more about that as we move towards World War II, the appeasement policy. Unemployment dropped, however, as a result of these massive public works projects, building the Autobahn roads, for example, which would eventually be used by the German tanks to get forces to the front lines during World War II. The Depression seemed to be ending by the time we get to the late 1930s. The Nazis also staged mass demonstrations and spectacles to keep morale high throughout Germany. Some of the largest were held in Nuremberg, Germany, and many of these would be filmed, and eventually the footage would be collected together and produced into a propaganda film to promote the Nazi Party and show the glory of Hitler and Nazi Germany. This will be a film called Triumph of the Will that was directed by a German propagandist named Leni Riefenstahl. She was a woman also, which is incredible because the Nazis really demoted the influence of women, making them stay at home and have babies. But this particular woman was one of the Nazi propagandists. We'll talk more about her in a later part of this lecture. The Nazis also controlled both the Catholic and Protestant churches as well as all the schools. Ultimately, they had control over everything. Women played a special role in the Aryan state as bearers of the Aryan children, as I said before. The Nazis said that women were to be wives and mothers, while men were to be warriors and political leaders. The Nazis also controlled the types of work that women could do and strongly encouraged them to stay at home and raise babies for the Third Reich. Good Aryan babies, that is. Once in power, the Nazi Party enacted programs against the Jewish people, since that was part of his agenda that Hitler outlined in Mein Kampf. Anti-Semitism was a big part of the Nazi agenda. In 1935, the Nazis under Hitler passed the Nuremberg Laws, which first prevented Jews from being German citizens. It took their citizenship away from them. Just overnight, their citizenship is gone. It forbade marriages between Jews and other German citizens. And it required Jews to wear yellow stars of David on their clothing as an outward sign of them being Jewish, and to carry identification cards saying they were Jewish. They kept meticulous records in Nazi Germany. So if you were a Jew, if you were suspected of being a Jew and you did not wear the star, you were not wearing the star, did not have papers saying that you were a Jew, you would be hauled in for questioning, and they would eventually track down your birth records and find out that you were. Then you would be sent to a camp or executed as a traitor to the state. Eventually, there will be even more violence against the Jews. As we know, eventually it's going to culminate in the Holocaust during World War II. But after the Nuremberg Laws, the next step happened in 1938. On the night of November 9th, the Nazis burned Jewish synagogues and destroyed thousands of Jewish businesses in what is known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Shattered Glass. They killed at least 100 people in this one night and sent 30,000 Jewish men to concentration camps. This was seen as, no longer are we just going to boycott Jewish businesses and synagogues, etc. We're going to destroy them. Eventually, this will be the beginning of the concentration of the Jews, first into certain parts of town, into ghettos, and then eventually into concentration camps. After Kristallnacht, Jews were barred from all public transportation, all schools, and all hospitals. They were not allowed to own, manage, or work in a retail store, and Jews were encouraged to leave Germany. Many did leave Germany, but others could not afford to leave Germany and leave everything behind. Also, what we start seeing by the end of the 1930s, because the Great Depression was so widespread, many nations closed their borders because they could not afford to take in immigrants. They had a hard enough time feeding the regular population they had. So really there were very few places for the German Jews to go. Now, there are also some cultural and intellectual trends that we need to talk about. We'll talk more specifics about the Holocaust and all of that as we move into World War II. But what about the cultural and intellectual trends in the interwar period? How did the new movements in arts and literature reflect the changes after World War I? Mass culture, as we've talked about before, radio and movies were a big part of this. In the late 19th century, inventions such as motion pictures and discoveries such as wireless radio waves changed mass communication forever. We discussed a little bit of this with the Second Industrial Revolution. By the time we get to the 1920s, after World War I, they had perfected all of these mass communications. And the first full-length motion pictures came out just before World War I and were even more widespread after World War I. During the next decades, movies became an important part of mass entertainment. By the end of the 1930s, 40% of adults in industrialized nations were seeing one movie per week. as part of their leisure time. That will, of course, be after some recovery. Economic recovery begins after the Great Depression. Radio and movies were used for political purposes as well. The Nazis, as I mentioned before, realized the value of radio and broadcast Hitler's speeches over the air every time he had a rally. The impact was great. His speeches were full of rhetoric and full of excitement for many German people. And they saw his rage as sincere, and he would stir them all up into a frenzy, and they would all start yelling and screaming, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, to support what he was arguing in his speeches. To increase the radio audience, the Nazis urged radio manufacturers to produce cheaper radios and allow people to buy them using time payments, meaning make payments on them on credit. The Nazis also used movies to spread propaganda. The Nazi propaganda minister was Joseph Goebbels, and he understood that movies were an excellent way to influence the masses. He created a special propaganda film division as a result. One of the most famous Nazi films was the one I mentioned before, directed by Leni Riefenstahl and called Triumph of the Will, which presented Hitler in these Nuremberg rallies that he was holding as the savior of Germany. Showed the glory of Germany, showed the glory of Hitler, showed the glory of the Nazi Party, and ultimately, made the German people feel as if they were part of a greater movement, that they were going to control their own destinies finally, once and for all, and be able to rise out of the ashes that they had been suffering in due to the aftermath of World War I. The documentary film showed the 1934 Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg and conveyed the power and glory of the Nazis. After World War I, the 8-hour workday became common for many Europeans, and people began to have more free time. Leisure activities such as attending professional sports events and traveling became very popular, more so prior to 1929 when the Great Depression hit, however. People will use trains, buses, and cars to reach their destinations, and totalitarian states used mass leisure to help control the people. Sometimes they controlled what activities people could participate in. There would be official sports that would be sanctioned by the state, and they encouraged young boys to participate in these to learn how to strategize and to fight and to be strong, and this would all translate great when they would eventually go back to war. They would have strong, able-bodied men ready to fight in the army. For example, the Nazis had a program called Strength Through Joy, which offered cultural activities, sporting events, and inexpensive vacations for the people of Germany. These activities were intended to fill the leisure time of working people and to keep them happy. And this happiness was due to the goodwill of the Nazi Party. So, therefore, enthusiastic supporters of the Nazi Party continued. Many Europeans experienced profound despair, however, following World War I, especially becoming entrenched as the Great Depression hit. The horror of the war left them convinced that there was something profoundly wrong with human beings and with Western values. The Great Depression, as I said, and the rise of fascist movements, as well as communist movements, right-wing and left-wing totalitarianism, increased these feelings. Political and social despair led to intellectual uncertainties, and these uncertainties were expressed in the arts after World War I. We've already read some World War I poetry in the previous unit. And you will see that this is sort of an extension of that trend, the feelings of alienation and loss and disenchantedness. Many people felt that the world made no sense anymore and was absurd. Dada was a style of art that expressed the idea that life had no purpose and that things were absurd. The Dadists created artworks to express the insanity of life. One technique they used was called photomontage, which is making a picture by combining photographs. You can see to the right here a Dadaist work where they took the Mona Lisa and they put a mustache and beard on her. The first Dada show was held in Berlin in 1920, prior to the rise of the Nazis, because the Nazis did not like Dada. They saw it as degenerative art, and they will outlaw it. But this is before then. Surrealism also is another artistic trend showing the absurdity of life. It expressed a reality beyond the material world. Surrealist artists often depicted scenes from the unconscious mind, including fantasies and dreams. Probably the most famous of the surrealist artists is Salvador Dali from Spain. Salvador Dali was a Spanish painter who used recognizable objects in fantastic ways to create strange and irrational images. Now, as you see here, Germany had been the center for modern art, which particularly offended the Nazis. So once the Nazis came to power, Hitler condemned that modern art as degenerate. The Nazis instead proposed a German art that would glorify the strength and heroism of the Aryan race instead. So massive book burnings, burnings of paintings and other art, anything that was seen as dangerous to the Nazi agenda or as not glorifying the Aryan state would be subject to cleansing and censorship in Germany under Nazi dictatorship. In literature, there was great interest in the unconscious mind, as I said before. This is, of course, basing off of what they had learned about psychology through Freud, just prior to World War I, with the id, the ego, and the superego. The Irish writer James Joyce wrote a book called Ulysses in 1922, and others like him will write like him, and they use a new kind of writing known as stream of consciousness. This is a new technique of writing to record their innermost thoughts and their characters. The problem with stream of consciousness writing is that it's hard to follow sometimes because there's not a lot of punctuation, there's not a lot of sentence structure, and it's basically just writing whatever pops into your head. The German writer Hermann Hesse wrote a book called Siddhartha, which was influenced by Freud's psychology as well as Buddhism, and it focused on the psychological confusion of modern life. And we also see a change in physics, the heroic age of physics. During the years following World War I, the long-held Newtonian views of physics became kind of undermined. Okay, remember the Newtonian ideas of physics, there are natural laws that govern the universe. If you could just figure out what those natural laws are, you can figure out how the universe behaves. Okay, natural laws like gravity, etc., etc. We've already talked about how Einstein kind of took some of those ideas and kind of placed them on their ear, if you will, saying that, yeah, there are natural laws that govern the universe. There is gravity and those kinds of things, but they're not consistent. They're not exactly the same everywhere. Instead, they're relative to each system. Y'all remember us talking about that in a previous unit. Now we see Newtonian laws being challenged even more through these new thinkers, okay? These new theories were sort of feeding off of the works of Albert Einstein that had initially challenged some of the original ideas of Newton, okay? And showed that all phenomena could not be completely defined and completely predicted. Not everything could be completely understood. In 1927, the German physicist Werner Heisenberg explained what he called the uncertainty principle. According to Heisenberg, the behavior of subatomic particles was not predictable. This suggests that all physical laws are based on uncertainty or randomness instead of natural laws that govern the universe consistently. Heisenberg's ideas constituted a new worldview, one that challenged the old certainties of Newtonian physics. And if you see here in the illustration, it shows you we can know position or momentum accurately, but not both simultaneously. And that's about the only way I know to explain it, folks. We might have to ask the physics teacher more specifics about this.